This lecture will be the last lecture in our Civil Rights series. This lecture will be focusing particularly on the Black Power movement, which was a black nationalist movement that existed in the late 1960s. The Black Power movement was a new racial philosophy focused by an increasing number of African Americans in the 1960s. It could mean many things. Most of the time, it suggested a move away from interracial cooperation and towards increased awareness of racial distinctiveness. It's part of a long nationalist tradition among blacks that extended back into slavery and that had its most visible 20th century expression in the Garvey movement. If you remember, during the 1920s, Marcus Garvey promoted his black nationalism, which was the exact same thing as the Black Power movement, moving away from interracial cooperation and towards an increased awareness of racial distinctiveness. In other words, be proud of your culture, be proud of your background, celebrate what makes you different without the idea of giving up any sort of equality or equity. And this, of course, is sort of the symbol of the Black Power movement, the fist raised at the 1968 68 Olympics. Malcolm X was probably one of the most celebrated members of the Black Power movement. A former drug addict and pimp, he was the most celebrated of the black Muslims. He did not advocate violence, but he insisted that black people had the right to defend themselves. He died in 1965 when a black gunman, presumably under orders from rivals within the Nation of Islam, assassinated him in New York. The Nation of Islam was once an obscure black nationalist group. The movement taught blacks to take responsibility for their lives, to be disciplined, and to live by strict codes of behavior and to reject any dependence on whites. Now, the Nation of Islam is not Islam. They're two different organizations. Islam is a religion. The Nation of Islam is a political nationalist group. So, black Muslims are members of the Nation of Islam, but they're not necessarily religiously Muslim. It's two very, very different groups. So, Malcolm X was a member of the Nation of Islam, thus he was a black Muslim, but that doesn't necessarily mean he was Muslim. And this is his image here. Stokely Carmichael originally started out as a member of SNCC and CORE. He participated in the Congress of Racial Equality's Freedom Rides in 1961, and by 1964 he was a field organizer for SNCC in Alabama. However, in 1966, he set off controversy calling for black power. Remember, SNCC really believed in interracial cooperation. And so the idea of black power, removing that piece, was something that SNCC didn't agree with. Eventually, in 1969, Stokely Carmichael will immigrate to Cockney, Guinea, where he'll spend the rest of his life calling himself a Pan-African revolutionary. But for the most part, he'll end up on the political fringe. Then we have the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was founded in October 1966 in Oakland, California by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. The name was shortened to the Black Panther Party, and it began spreading eastward towards black urban ghetto cities across the U.S. The Black Panther Party was known for wanting to arm blacks to protect themselves. And one of the places that they really rose to attention was during the Watts Riots of 1965. The Watts Riots of 1965 was the first large race riot since the end of World War II. A white police officer struck a protesting black bystander, which triggered a storm of anger and a week of violence. It really revealed how deeply blacks in Los Angeles and in other cities resented their treatment at the hands of local police. As many as 10,000 people were estimated to have participated in the violence. They attacked white motorists, burned buildings, looted stores, and sniped at policemen. Eventually, they'll be quelled by the National Guard. 34 people will die at the Watts uprising. 28 of the dead were black. So despite the fact that they were the ones leading the charge in the riots, they were the ones that were most likely to be killed in the race riots, which is very similar to other race riots in American history. As we said, 1968 was going to be a pivotal year for the civil rights movement. In April, we have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. In October, at the 1968 Olympics, you see the two runners who are going to raise their hands in a sign of black power while standing on the podium. And as Alan Brinkley said, Rioters noisily made news, but thousands of blacks quietly made history. By the late 1960s, several hundred black elected officials in the Old South, and by 1972, nearly half of Southern black students sat in integrated classrooms, more schools than in the North. The focus will now turn to other minority groups: women, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, um, the gay liberation movement, as well as the counterculture movement in protest to Vietnam. So this is the famous photo right after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and of course the 1968 Olympics. So our next lectures will be focusing on LBJ and JFK, not their civil rights actions, but rather their political actions while in office.